mean, first of all, I suppose I always think about psychoanalysis as my sort of first philosophy, if you like. It's where I go back to always as a kind of theoretical base to think through whatever issues I'm trying to think about.
Well, I guess my relationship to psychoanalysis is complex, as I guess lots of people's is, in that I'm in many ways a fundamentalist believer in the importance of Freud and those who followed Freud and psychoanalytic thought, and it informs almost all of my research, a lot of my teaching and a lot of my daily life. At the same time, I remain profoundly critical of its institutionalization and the more normative organizational inflections and developments of psychoanalysis.
I am a clinician, so I have a vested interest in believing in Freud, and I'm using ideas derived from him or his followers every day in my practice. So I can be critical, if you like, up to a point.
When you ask me to think of a space in a discussion of psychoanalysis in London, I mean, one can't help but think of the Freud Museum in London as a space in which we have Freud's consulting room there, recreated in a sense that it was moved from Vienna to London in 1938 and set up. So the space that comes to my mind is Freud's consulting room at 20 Maresfield Gardens. We still are indebted to Freud and go on using the spatial layout of the consulting room that Freud created, which is to say a couch and a chair with an analyst out of sight of the patient. So the idea being that the patient then is freed up to be able to free associate without having to make eye contact with the analyst, but also because Freud said candidly he couldn't bear to be stared at all day by his patient. So he created this space that's really a kind of unique space. Freud's invention of the psychoanalytic consulting room is part of his legacy.
My room is fairly small. There's 3 chairs. So I have one chair and the patient has a choice of one of 2 different chairs, one more face-to-face, one more at an angle, or to lie down on a couch where I'm at the foot of the couch. It's somewhere where I really feel I'm at home in, almost becomes an extension of my personality. It's not a very big room, and that, I think, it gives the patient some choice. And in fact, people can choose, they can start in one chair, move to another, might even risk lying down on the couch. That becomes really interesting, and that becomes a story in itself.
I've been trying to think about a space that represents psychoanalysis to me, and I think I'd like to talk about a tension between 2 wonderful spaces. One is a place that I worked for 10 years, the Tavistock Clinic in London. Now the other space is just around the corner, which is the Freud Museum, which used to be the home, it was for the last year of his life, or just under, it was the home of Sigmund Freud. And then it was the home of his daughter, Anna. It's a very evocative space. It's a kind of shrine as well as a working museum. Tavistock Clinic is a working clinical organisation. So they're really quite different, but between them, they kind of cover quite a bit of the history of British psychoanalysis since the Second World War in particular. And I think as you walk between them, you kind of feel this sort of shift in the psychoanalytic terrain. It's a sort of, mist that descends. You're kind of slightly back into the 1940s and those debates, but you're also very much in the present in terms of what it can mean to continue to develop a way of curating psychoanalysis, that's the job of a museum, and a way of practicing psychoanalysis, that's the job of a clinic, what that can mean now.
And one of the things that we've done here at Birkbeck is to start to use medical humanities in a practice-based way to help clinicians think about the kind of patient encounter, the clinical encounter, and what's happening between them and the patient, in a way that medicine and biomedicine perhaps doesn't quite equip them with the vocabulary to do that. And so I take us back to psychoanalysis there as a therapeutic practice, and think about the work of people like Jessica Benjamin, a contemporary psychoanalytic theorist, who helps us to think about what happens between the analyst and the patient. The kind of co-constructed nature of what she calls a kind of third space, a thirdness between clinician and patient, which in psychoanalysis is a kind of, that notion of an in-between is a very kind of common understanding of a transmission of affect between 2 people. something that doctors don't often get a chance to think about when they're thinking about clinical practice with patients.
I'm definitely of the view that the kind of clinic is central to psychoanalysis, and also that many of the terms, the vocabulary that we use when we talk psychoanalytically actually depend on the clinic as its context, and they change their meaning when you move outside that.
Psychoanalysis furnishes us with a whole range of ideas that might have originated in the clinic but are really very helpful for thinking about social and political issues, whether that's the notion of identification, melancholia, the whole issue about fantasy and the place of fantasy in psychic and social life, the idea of the transference that all sorts of ideas about memory and time and how they function in the present.
I'm interested in cross-disciplinary dialogue between history and literature and other fields, but also very interested in the relationship between history and psychoanalysis. And there's a vexed and complicated history of encounters between historians and psychoanalysts in the 20th and early 21st centuries that one can map and trace. But I think there are also really interesting methodological questions now for both historians and psychoanalysts if they enter into dialogue with one another about how far one can assume universal features of the mind and how far mind, intentions, motives, behaviour, desires, drives, all the rest of it, are contingent on particular times and places.
What was of interest to me was the ways in which feminists were able to actually intervene in and transform psychoanalytic thinking, just as, for me, it was very important that Freudian thinking and psychoanalysis could add complexity to our understandings of gender difference. So we would think in the beginning of a sort of nature-nurture background, like Anne Oakley, stressing, well, gender is mainly learnt, not just biologically given. But for many of us, it seemed that we couldn't just understand it in terms of conditioning or learning, because there seemed to be something sort of fundamental in our attachment to gender, in our what we would call now our desire for gender. Our very bedrock as people is indeed secured very often through thinking of ourselves as women or men. And, women's liberation obviously very much thought of itself in terms of, we are the women, I am woman, hear me roar. And so, therefore, there was something about psychoanalysis that seemed to be able to help us understand why it was this bedrock, but then, of course, why it was such a shaky and insecure bedrock, why it was so precarious as a bedrock.
I think one of the things that struck me as interesting about Freud from the very beginning is that there's a sort of upside-down logic to the way in which he theorises, for example, dreams or slips of the tongue or symptoms, which is that he works backwards from finding the symptom first, undoing it, and then saying that's obviously how it was done up. And that's very close to literary theory. One of the ways that it works for literary reading is that, again, you're doing your interpreting and you're inferring from that the object was put together in the way you're undoing. And that seems to me terribly literary, so I find that very interesting. The other thing I find particularly interesting about Freud is that, in a sense, he's saying that everything, a gesture, an action, a thought, everything is an utterance. And no utterance is ever innocent. A lot of what goes on in the creation of a text or something else like it is unconscious. You asked me to think about a significant place in relation to me in psychoanalysis. And I, as I do in many contexts, thought back to Jerusalem. I think what Jerusalem means to me particularly is associated with my childhood, because I was there for about a year when I was 2. So it remains the object of desire and nostalgia, I guess, and the language is part of it for me.
I would say that for me, psychoanalysis and literature have a very, very intimate relationship, because they both take the lid off, basically, and they both say things that can't be said anywhere else. I always say to my students, okay, where are the places in the culture? This was about 30 years ago, before trans, and and bisexuality became causes of freedom and objects of emancipation and subjects of emancipation, I would say, where in the culture can you go if you're a woman and say, actually, I'm not, without being carted off? And one is the psychoanalytic session, the other one is the pages of a literary text.
I'm increasingly interested in my work in thinking about how different forms of artistic representation, whether it be literature or film, as I say, I began in literature, I'm much more interested now in film specifically, but how modes of representation which aren't necessarily explicit about what they are preoccupied by, how does the spectator or the reader make use of these works? How does the reader or the spectator intuit a problem or a trauma when that problem or trauma is not stated or represented explicitly?
It's interesting, psychoanalysis emerged at a kind of colonial moment in the late 19th century, and it shares in many of the assumptions of colonial theorists, particularly about primitive races, for example, the difference between being civilized and being barbaric. And at the same time, it assumes the presence in each one of us of a kind of barbaric primitive being called the unconscious. And that gives it both a kind of rootedness in certain modes of disciplinary practice that we might want to critique, and at the same time it gives us the tools to do that critique. How does it come about that irrationality explodes right in the middle of the apparently most advanced societies in Europe in the middle of the 20th century?
I mean, I started with a PhD called The Case of Peter Pan, or the Impossibility of Children's Fiction. And my question there was, what is the collective phantasmagoria that Peter Pan is carrying? Not what is the pathology of J.M. Barrie, but what is it that attracts us to this story? And what damage are we doing to our internal image of childhood, let alone children themselves, by fostering this myth of psychic innocence? And then, of course, under investigation, the story fell apart and revealed itself as anything but innocent.
So trying to use psychoanalysis in doing empirical research has meant for me, first of all, abandoning the semi-structured interview with a kind of preset list of questions that attempt to kind of cover the field, and asking much bigger, more open-ended, narrative-inducing questions. So giving the floor to the interviewee much more, giving them much more space to construct their answer themselves, asking them, to tell their story in a fairly open-ended way. And then, but mainly the psychoanalytic moment kind of comes in during the process of analysing the interview material, and paying attention first of all to the kind of explicit discourses that interviewees use, which is what sociologists tend to do, but then also to pay attention to the silences that fall when someone's given the space to speak. Where do those silences happen? Where do interviewees suddenly shift register, tone? Where's the emotionality? Where does that come out? The free associations that people make. I mean, there's a lot of attention, I think, in working psychoanalytically with interview material to the associations that people make.
Psychoanalysis is famously the talking cure. So what is it about language that ideally facilitates finding refuge or comfort, solace, but also can be transformative? A lot of work that's being done with, asylum seekers, refugees, people who've been persecuted, in the Middle East, Africa, and so on, particularly victims of, direct persecution, people who've witnessed traumatic events or have been tortured. And in those cases, language is often a factor in the treatment. What language is used, what language was used by the persecutors. Is this a language that they identify with? Is it a language that they really would not rather even think about, and so on?
I've always been interested actually in spaces that are on the edge of cities, that are those kinds of odd liminal spaces where things grow, often things like buddleia, sort of big plants that grow in dereliction, in spaces of dereliction. And I remember seeing a film by Patrick Keeler a long time ago, I think it was called London, which actually just charts those spaces. And I suppose those kinds of spaces, if I think about the real struggle in an analysis or in something, any kind of life experience which involves some kind of change, which usually involves some kind of loss, so something that has to be given up in order to move into a different kind of mental or emotional space. For me, they have that quality, I suppose, of both something that can grow in a space that has felt desolate in some ways or derelict in some ways. So I suppose a visual representation of those moments of change, psychic change, that are a real struggle, because we sort of hate them as well as want them. Those moments, I think, are sort of captured in Patrick Keeler's film around those edge of city kinds of spaces.
I guess the space that's been most important in terms of my intellectual development and my early academic work was Greenham Common and the Women's Peace Camp at Greenham Common. It's been hugely formative for me personally. I mean, I first went there when I was 15, and I left school to go and live at Greenham when I was 17. And so I was a kind of participant in this kind of amazing, life-changing, world-changing social movement. And then kind of some years later, having done a degree and sort of basically seen that there'd been very little written about it, I thought I should do a PhD about it. So I ended up writing a PhD about Greenham, doing interviews with women who'd been involved, really trying to struggle to understand the impact that the movement had had on the world and on the women who were involved and on their families and the wider communities, on sort of political and social formations of the kind of 1980s and early 90s. So it's a place that haunts me. I mean, I think a kind of psychoanalytic idea of haunting is quite valuable there in recognising how places and people and experiences that are, actually historically long past are still with you and alive within you.
Undergraduate students are so receptive to Freud, and I think the reason why they are is because they just left home and they found out within 3 weeks they haven't left home at all. They've taken the whole load with them, and that can lead to anything from depression to kind of, creative writing to, you name it. But they love Freud, because Freud also gives students who are meant to have got to university and be on top of the world and terribly happy the right to be miserable, the right to think, actually, this isn't so great and I've got problems, and, it's very, very emancipatory.
So this is a really live tradition. I have some mixed feelings about it, because I think sometimes psychoanalysis can be used in a speculative way, can't quite be tested when you apply it, say, to a literary text, in the same way that it can be when you use it with a patient. The text doesn't answer back and say, no, that's wrong. Nevertheless, it's enormously creative. It is a theory about how irrationality works, what we do with it, how it affects us in our lives. There's plenty of things going on in the wider social world that are deeply irrational, and it would be a shame not to be able to use psychoanalytic insights in order to try and make sense of those.